Good morning, everybody, and welcome to another customer care group support webinar. Today we're going to be talking about security in OnBase, most specifically rights and privileges.
So while this may not be brand new material for a lot of people, this is something that working in customer support, we kind of get a feel for recurring issues that we get with a lot of customers, and I think we can all say that there's a lot of times that some of the basics here are kind of either overlooked or overlapped, and we kind of wanted to re-highlight some of the necessities that kind of make OnBase the system it is and kind of help people work through it a bit.
And we'll run through these basics here on the webinar, and we encourage you at the end of the webinar to write in some questions in the chat or in the questions window, and we'll answer them if you've got specific questions on how rights and privileges interact with OnBase.
Exactly. So going into it, you have your Navient Customer Care Group. We have Jennifer Henkonet, who I'm sure you all know is our Senior Solution Support Specialist. Her and Jennifer Siegel are notably known as the two Jens. They've been here quite some time. Andy Petito is with us today, myself, Jason Wilhelm, and Drew Bullock, who is our newest member. Not featured in the picture, but if you ever give us a call and need some help, there's a good chance to get him. He's extremely knowledgeable as well.
Mm-hmm. Shooting the way up the ranks quickly.
Exactly.
So as always, the audience is muted. There's a chat box available for comments and questions, and we'll be sending out a survey again at the end of the webinar. Please fill it out and let us know how we did and what we can do better next time. And if you need to find our previous webinars, they're all available on our website, navient.com/resources/video. You'll see there's a little box you can expand to show all of the support webinars.
Yeah. Any questions you guys have, we'll kind of be noticing those as they're coming in. We'll try to answer them as we find appropriate. Otherwise, we may hold them to the end and kind of address them then. But please, as we're talking, as we're working, shoot them through and let them know that if there's anything we need to do, we'll try to answer them as we can. So for the agenda today, like we said, we're going to be talking about security in OnBase with rights and privileges. We're going to be going through product rights, privileges, security keywords, which are always fun, override privileges. We're going to be talking a little bit about the least restrictive rule, which I'm guessing you can also know we're going to be talking about most restrictive as well. And finally, we're going to be touching base a little bit on workflow security, which could nearly be its own webinar in itself.
Absolutely. Workflow security interacts with OnBase in a unique way, and it complements the product rights and privileges that we'll go over in just a bit, and we'll tell you why.
Exactly. So getting started, product rights. I'm sure you guys have seen a screen similar to this one setting up user groups. We just took a screenshot from one of our own lab VMs here, but this is when you're going into config and under your user and user groups, the different product rights that you can assign to different user groups. As you can see, they're obviously segregated into different categories. You have your registered processing products, some administrative privileges, configuration, and then administrative processing privileges.
So this is where you'd set whether a user is allowed to log in with the thick client versus the web client, or whether they're allowed to run a cold process or configure a cold process, something like that.
Mm-hmm. And these are obviously, you set these up per user group. So obviously a lot of, different users are going to be members to different user groups. So you kind of want to set these per user group that you want to allow to go in there.
Correct. And this also gives you the overriding OnBase configuration privilege there in the lower left corner. It goes along with the configuration privileges elsewhere in the product rights in the user groups menu.
Mm-hmm. So like we said, to get into these, product rights for different OnBase modules can be assigned to users within a selected user group, customizing the access of different users. To do this, you need to be able to have access to configuration, and once in config, at the top you go to the users, user groups, and rights, and you select the user group to be configured and click on the product rights, which is one of the boxes on the right-hand side to assign it and get that dialog box. In the box there, should you be launching this with the Romanzo switch on, you will get an additional button at the bottom that is going to give you the ability to select all. This is helpful for when you don't want to select every single checkbox.
Correct. The Romanzo switch, if you're not familiar with it, adding Romanzo in all caps to the configuration module gives you access to a couple of, actually a large number of otherwise hidden configuration features that you should probably look up in the related MRG before trying to play around with them. Some of them can be either very taxing on the system if you enable them, or other ones can change fundamental parts of the system in unexpected ways.
Right, and for anyone who's been through any of the Highland sysadmin classes, there's a bit that's talked about in depth on there too. So, like you said, you can research a little bit more in the MRGs there, but the biggest thing this does is it gives you the ability to select all for, anytime you're doing a manager group or a super user, it's going to give you that select all feature.
It's useful. It's not something you're going to use a whole lot, which is why it's under the Romanzo switch. But if it's pressed accidentally, you can immediately give a super user access to the system. You would need to do this if you, say, license some new modules. By default, those product rights are not going to appear in your manager group, so you'd want to make sure that you go into your manager group once in a while and use the select all button to turn on all of the features for manager.
Exactly. And like we said, full details of what each product checkbox enables can be found in the sysadmin MRG. Even though we have users that have been using the system for a decade or longer, always helpful to go in there and kind of just refresh memory with, there are a lot of different checkboxes you can do here, and while the description may be helpful, they are also not the complete picture, and you can get a lot more information from the total definitions within the MRG. So some of the things that we wanted to highlight in here, you do have a button there that just says workflow. What this allows is system work, timer work, load balancing, and workflow log purges to be executed in OnBase. This privilege also allows users to manually route documents in the lifecycle using the route document option. This privilege grants rights to the workflow server queues tabs in the workstation options dialog box. Kind of one that people just say workflow, here we go, and it's off and running, but kind of something that gives a little bit more detail into what it does. One of the other boxes that we want to highlight is utilities. This enables access to the document lock administration, process lock administration, folder maintenance, and document maintenance dialog boxes for the unlocking, undeleting, or purging of documents and folders. Something to highlight, it also enables access to load bitmaps and icon dialog for importing system icons. In the Unity client and Business Process Management modular, this option allows a user to see and manage all locks for all users in the Manage Locks dialog box. So that was what we would call a brief overview of product rights.
Right.
Gosh, I think product rights covers quite a few pages alone in the MRG, but if you think about the complexity of OnBase and what we allow and disallow our users to see and do and have access to, product rights is huge. This will be a massive decider in what users can see, what they can do, and if you have users that claim to have functionality or think they need to have functionality, this is where you get it all set up.
And you'll notice that the workflow product right that we highlighted here mentions that it's a privilege, and it enables some specific functions you can do in workflow. Oddly, the workflow product right doesn't actually give you rights to open workflow. That's handled in the privileges page, which we're going to get to in just a second here. So there is some overlap between the product rights and privileges pages. That's important to take a look at and an important distinction to make. So again, the MRG is really your best friend when it comes to learning about what these settings do.
Exactly. So transitioning into that, product rights, the products you have rights to. Now we're going to go into privileges. Privileges are obviously a little bit different. You can see the way that the groups here are segregated. You have documents, folders, scanned index batches, client features, and client-based products. Again, you have some product rights in the privileges. You had some privileges in the product rights.
Probably the biggest difference is the upper left corner where we had client, thick client, web client, whatever. Here we've got actual privileges. We've got retrieve or view, create, modify, etc. This is generally where you're going to be making the changes for privileges for people for what they can do with OnBase documents.
Exactly.
With, again, the notable exception of workflow and the other checkboxes in the client product rights section in the upper right.
Right. The nice thing with this is that these are broken down, so you can kind of give kind of a la carte privileges to certain user groups. Depending on how you've built your system's organization and flowchart, you kind of want to be careful when, maybe having one user in multiple user groups and kind of figuring out the way that those go with that, because, if you give a user a delete right here, which we'll go into in a bit, you'll see that that's actually going to go, across the board on it. So one of the things just to kind of keep in mind when looking through this. So looking at this, configuring user group privileges, user groups must be assigned document and folder privileges, as well as privileges to use certain OnBase features and modules. These privileges define what actions users within the user group can and cannot perform within OnBase. Each of the OnBase modules must have a purchase license, in addition to having the associated privileges and product rights in order to access them. So something obviously just to keep in mind with that. Once again, to find these, you go into config, select user groups and rights. On the right-hand side, you kind of have a series of boxes there. You'll see privileges on the right-hand side over there. Some of the things that we did want to highlight and kind of just bring to the front end is that document privileges assigned to a user group pertain to every document type in which the users in the user group have access. This is just one of those things that is sometimes overlooked, and it is not kind of immediately recognized. You can configure certain document types to override these document privileges in user groups and rights document type settings.
So what does that mean? That means, for example, if you apply the print privilege to one of these user groups, all of the document types that a user has access to even from their other user groups, they'll be able to print. And you have to use override privileges to remove the print privilege if you don't want them to be able to print certain document types.
Right. So a couple of things we wanted to highlight on the privileges as well. You have retrieve and view. So something to be cautioned of is that retrieve and view privilege does not restrict users from being able to see a list of documents in a document search results list, including any keyword values displayed in the auto name string. Pause right there. So obviously within a retrieve and view, you have the ability to retrieve documents, and you will get that hit list of all the documents that you have, in that particular query that you're running. Now, depending on how you have the name set up there, the auto name string can be set up using keywords that maybe you don't want your users to be seeing. A terrible example would be, let's say your HR documents include the user's social security number. We really hope that that is never the case. But while the user may not have the ability to open the document and get access to the actual document itself, they will have access to the auto name string, which could have sensitive information in there. So you want to make sure when setting those up that they are useful and pertaining to how you are recognizing what the documents are, but you also don't want them giving any further insight into what is actually in the document. That will potentially be a security breach.
Yeah, we kind of have a habit of putting too much information in our auto name strings sometimes. I know here we've gotten to a point where we actually can't open documents sometimes because the auto name string is too long.
Yes.
When we try and save it out of OnBase. It's important to put enough information in the auto name string so you know what the document is, but not so much information that you're leaking sensitive information. So yeah, in Jason's example, if you track your social security number on your HR documents, hooray, that's fine. Generally, you'd want to make that a hidden keyword.
True.
And definitely you wouldn't want to include it in the auto name string. Retrieve and view will not restrict someone from seeing a social security number in an auto name string if that's how you have your auto name string defined.
Mm-hmm. Next one we want to bring up is workflow. So one of the privileges you'll see there is, there's two of them. There's workflow and there's workflow restricted. Workflow enables all workflow functionality in the client module, the ability to execute user work, purge documents, etc. Licensing for workflow is obviously also required to kind of go hand in hand in that. The workflow restricted option is automatically selected and becomes disabled for the selection when workflow option is selected. If you deselect this option, the workflow restriction option stays selected. If you do not wish to grant this privilege, you must manually deselect it. Workflow restricted enables workflow functionality in the client module, but denies client users the option to execute workflow or add to workflow from the right-click menu. So what that's kind of highlighting is saying that from outside of workflow, if the user is able to access workflow, that's fine. They're able to get into workflow, do the work they want to do, and that's what it is. But this is saying that if they retrieve a document and they want to either add it to workflow or execute workflow that's on the document, workflow restricted is not going to give them the ability to do this.
So this specifically limits a user to using workflow in workflow only.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if everyone here knows it, but workflow and the rest of OnBase can be pretty closely intertwined depending on how you built your system. You can, push a document into a queue with the right-click menu in a custom query or vanilla retrieval. Mm-hmm. There are system tasks that you can assign to document types, allowing you to execute workflow logic on a document even if it's not in a queue, not in workflow at all. And in this case, you have the right-click option to execute workflow, which means add the document to its initial life cycle, or add to workflow, which lets you put it in a specific queue from a right-click menu outside of workflow. So in vanilla retrieval, custom query, whatever. And the workflow restricted box allows you to turn that feature off. It means your users can use workflow, but only in workflow.
Right.
So combining that with, say, removing the ability to use some system tasks would end up completely divorcing a user group from workflow, requiring them to be in workflow to do any workflow.
Yeah. So what this kind of does is it kind of gives you two layers of workflow. Obviously, workflow is one of OnBase's largest modules, and we love having users have the ability to use it and work in it. This kind of gives you the option to say how much you want them to have the ability to work in it. So once again, just kind of a little more added functionality there. So once again, to bring it back up, we've obviously covered product rights and privileges, two of the bigger ones that kind of determine how users experience OnBase. This is definitely something that, in test environments, we encourage people to kind of set up different, turn certain product rights and privileges on and off to kind of see what that end user experience is like and make sure it is what we want them to experience. With these, though, there is some overlapping and intertwining between the two. So just keep that in mind when getting these set up, that if you kind of turn something on, it could have additional effects that are elsewhere. Moving along.
Yeah, so with that, we're going to get into one of the big bugbears of OnBase. So these are the two product rights and privileges, were the two, like, OnBase 101
yes.
kind of issues. If you fell asleep during those two sections, you don't have to apologize, I understand. Security keywords is something everyone's interested in, but really no one seems to understand.
Right.
And it allows you to restrict access to documents based on some unique criteria.
Exactly. So this is where you kind of go in to create new security keywords. You obviously have the key types you can select, condition being equal to or not equal to. We'll talk about that. Those are scary ones. And then the value that you want the security keyword wrapped around. We have seen both sides of the environment where we've seen this list be miles long of people trying to set up their entire OnBase security around security keywords.
It's a bad idea.
It's just a bad idea. That's the best way to put it. It makes things mucky.
I mean, it technically functions, but it's a bad idea.
Right.
But then we've also seen the opposite, where you don't have any security keywords, and you would really benefit from them based on business cases.
Right. So security keywords restrict the user's ability to view documents based on a document keyword value. Things to caution about: the OnBase thick client does not respect security keywords when executing SQL custom queries.
So, and Jason asked me about this earlier this week when we were putting this presentation together. What is a SQL custom query? If you're familiar with an OnBase custom query, you know, the most typical one would be a document type custom query where you set up a certain number of document types and some common keywords you want to search on for those document types, and you get, you know, a custom results list that you wouldn't be able to do in vanilla retrieval, or would be really difficult to do in vanilla retrieval. But there are a couple of other kinds of custom query. One of those is the SQL custom query. It lets you write some custom SQL as well as inserting parameters for your keyword types that lets you run more powerful queries on the OnBase database. The thing about that with security keywords is that the thick client does not respect them. It just runs the query. It doesn't respect the security keywords on the results that come back. So you'll be able to see documents you might not normally be able to see, or your users will be able to see documents they shouldn't be able to see.
Exactly.
The nice part, though, is this doesn't apply to the core. So web client, Unity client, Outlook integration, anything like that.
Application server based.
Yeah, anything application server based. The core does respect security keywords. So if you run a SQL custom query and you've got security keywords on documents that are restricting users from viewing them, they will work correctly as expected.
Exactly. So something to keep in mind when you do have users that are going to be operating in both, you know, they have a thick client, they have a Unity client, and you know they work in one versus the other. If there is security around it that you want to do it, obviously just be mindful of SQL custom queries. Next, security keywords do not restrict document viewing rights in workflow. Instead, the configuration of workflow keys determines access to documents. Currency, date, floating point keyword types cannot be configured as security keywords. Certain things just to keep in mind that they're not going to restrict the document viewing rights.
Even if you really want your HR people to only be able to view documents that are set to pi, you can't. Sorry.
Exactly. And last, OnBase does not support the use of wildcards in numeric keyword types. Instead, change the keyword type to be an alphanumeric keyword type that has a numeric mask, or duplicate the data in alphanumeric keyword types. So once again, just another feature to keep in mind. So we talked about it briefly before, but considerations for using not equal security keywords. Keep the following information in mind when configuring a not equal security keywords. Not equal is not designed to work with multiple values for a keyword type on a document, because if one instance is the specified value and one is not, only the keyword value that appears first alphabetically will be evaluated by the not equal to determine document access. We've seen a couple of these come in play that you think you are restricting a document from certain users, but because, like it says, because it appears first alphabetically, it will be evaluated by the not equal to determine the document access, and in turn, it actually allows the user to have access to it.
Correct. So the way security keywords work is you apply security keywords to users or user groups. And those are basically providing them with keys. And then you apply similar security keywords and the requirement for equal or not equal document types and document type groups. And those are the locks.
Right.
And an equal to security keyword will mean that these users will need this security keyword to view this document. And if you have multiple equal tos, they'll need all of them.
Yeah.
If you have multiple not equals, it will only evaluate the first one it comes across.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the setting up not equals is kind of, like we said, it's enticing to some, but when you start getting further and further down the rabbit hole, you kind of build yourself back into a corner, and there's times that you're either restricting everything or nothing's working on the end of it. So something just to keep in mind. Last thing we want to bring to attention is that when a user group is configured to have a security keyword with more than one value of not equal, a document can show up multiple times in the hit list. This is due to the query used to generate the result list. So just another example of where that can kind of be a little bit messy. So, like we said, we really don't want to stray people away from security keywords. There are times that they can be helpful and useful.
Absolutely, they're really, really handy for like restricting HR documents from general employees or your OnBase administrators who shouldn't be able to view them, even though they have to work with the system,
Exactly.
and they would otherwise have super user rights.
True. Moving along, override privileges.
Another place we see a lot of confusion.
Exactly. So override privileges is kind of I guess you could say a buried privilege. You kind of have to go through a couple levels to get there. But once you do, you kind of get a deeper ability to kind of set some pins in place that are going to work across the board.
So to get there, you head over to a document type, click on override privileges, and you get the screen on the left. You're like, what the heck does this mean? Well, you add the user groups you want to have override privileges. They appear on the pane to the right, and then you can set what privileges those user groups get. So the thing is, what we see on the right is a user group that has all of the override privileges available.
Right.
You can also see it says group default on that first column of checkboxes. You can't check those checkboxes, they're disabled. That's telling you what their effective permissions are before overrides. And then what actually happens, what will actually be set for them, is whatever you check in the user settings column, the column of checkboxes you can actually set. So keep in mind, you can remove privileges with override privileges. They don't just layer on top of your user group privileges. That's something that has come up before in the past. This is the way you remove rights from specific user groups. So,
as we talked about, so setting override privileges during document type configuration. A user group's default document type privileges are determined by setting the users under user group rights and privileges. You can override these default privileges of any user groups added in the assigned document type by user group box. The user may be a member of 2 or more user groups that have conflicting override privileges. When this occurs, you can specify whether to use the least or most restrictive effect over privileges, which we will get into
absolutely
after this. So when multiple user groups are selected from the selected list, the settings configured in the user right doc types dialog box will apply across all selected user groups. If a user has both, this is something just we want to kind of highlight and note because it is a little bit of an issue that we've run into with quite a few customers, but it's just something to highlight. If a user has both create and copy to clipboard/save as privilege for one document type, the user can access the send to create new document right-click option from documents in any document type. When the user creates a new document using this option, only document types for which the user has create privileges are available to assign to the new document.
So it's a double-edged sword. If you don't want your users to be able to right-click and send a new document, you have to make sure that they don't have that copy to clipboard save as privilege along with create. You know, it happens a lot with like scanning users where you need to give them create so they can scan and import documents. But then, you know, sometimes those users have multiple roles, so they get the save as privilege so they can save things out and send them to other people. That gives them the right-click option for creating a document type from another.
Right.
Now the thing is, with least restrictive set, that would give them the right-click option to send to create new document for all the document types they can look at, which can get confusing. But again, you might have the option, but they'll only be able to create, if they're legitimately supposed to be able to create new documents from these existing documents, they'll only be able to use the document types that they've already been assigned to.
Right.
So when they do right-click create, right-click send to new document, they'll only be able to pick the document types they've been assigned to.
Exactly. Just kind of building on what we're talking about and keeping in mind, you're going to get, from managers, supervisors, users, hey, I can do this, I can't do this, I want to be able to do this. What we're trying to highlight here is obviously, go through your product rights and privileges, look in there, but then also look in the override privileges and see, for a particular user group, have I given this user group some override privileges that may be crossing, users' ability to do certain things. maybe I really didn't want them to do. Or do I want to find a way to give specific user groups ways to do it or not?
So we mentioned a couple of times least to most restrictive, so we're going to get into that here.
Exactly.
So this is a specific setting that exists in global client settings,
right.
or the, I don't know where to put it, so let's put it here, place.
Exactly.
There's something to note about this, so let's go ahead and hit the next one here. So you can see least restrictive combines your document type overrides across multiple user groups to allow for least restrictive combination. What does that mean? That means permissions are additive. So you can have, for example, a user group called retrieve, and all it does is give people the retrieve privilege. Then you can have another user group called print, and all it does is give them the print privilege. And when a user belongs to retrieve and print, they can retrieve and print. Makes sense, doesn't it? That's what least restrictive does. Now, interestingly, this does not affect how override privileges work with default user group privileges. So if you have them in the retrieve group and the print group, and then you add an override for the print group that, let's say then they're also in the save group. But in the save group, you uncheck print. They won't be able to print, even though the print group has given them print permissions. The override privileges override everything, whether or not you have least or most restrictive set. Least and most restrictive comes into play when you have two user groups with similar with override privileges. So if you have overrides on save that says they can't print, you have overrides on print that says they can't save, that's when least and most restrictive comes into play. Least restrictive would allow them to save and print because they have it in one of their overrides. Most restrictive would not allow them to do either because they don't have it in all of their user group items. So most restrictive combines document type overrides across multiple user groups to allow the most restrictive combination. Privileges are subtractive. This would be one where you'd say, like, you'd have, master privilege group gives most of the privileges you want a normal user to have. Then you'd have, say HR frontline or HR specialist removes most of the privileges of, say, importing documents, scanning things, working in workflow, whatever. Gives, maybe it gives them more access. It gives them the same access to like folders and stuff that HR might need to use.
Right.
Your master group would need to have the same, need to have more privileges than this like HR specialist group, because HR specialist is going to end up pulling out privileges, subtracting privileges from that master group.
Right.
So it's just two different ways of setting up privileges in a system, whether you do additive permissions or subtractive permissions.
And if you do run into issues with user permissions, look here first, because this is going to decide how things are relatively set up. This is huge. This will decide if you're taking privileges away from certain user groups or you're adding them to other ones. But just you want to see what it is. Like we said, the least restrictive is set by default. Unless someone has gone in and changed this to most restrictive, that's going to kind of change the way permissions and privileges and overrides are set up in your system, as you can tell by the way that they're used for additive restrictions or additional ones.
Yeah, this is not a setting that you're going to be changing often because it does fundamentally change the way privileges work in OnBase. So you're basically, you're going to set this up when you do your discovery for a system implementation. You're going to decide whether you're going to be using additive or subtractive permissions. And that's when you'll set this rule, and you should never change it.
No.
So if privileges start acting wonky, yeah, this is the first place to look because it shouldn't have changed.
Correct.
And if someone changed it, it can completely foo-bar your system.
Right. So, thing to note though is that we are looking in global client settings, document type, permission overrides. Next, there's also global client settings, folder type permission overrides. So these look nearly the same. This option combines folder type overrides across multiple user groups to allow for the least restrictive combination of privileges per user. Once again, folder type permission overrides are set least restrictive by default. If you want to switch it around, and let's say your environment, you want to set it up in a different manner, you can switch to most restrictive, and this option combines folder type overrides across multiple user groups to allow for the most restrictive combination of privileges for a user.
Yeah, these are, you don't see folder type permission overrides used a whole lot. The least restrictive, most restrictive rule here. This is if your system is really heavily invested into foldering,
Right.
which some systems are. I mean, foldering and auto foldering can be really powerful, and it's a built-in feature, so a lot of people do use it. But you have to be really, really invested in foldering for this to really matter.
So we're going to wrap this up with here for the last few minutes is we're going to go into workflow security. We will admit now that this is, if you are an organization that uses workflow heavily, there's a lot that can be done within security within workflow itself, and something just to kind of keep in mind. So, like we said before, workflow security overrides all other security settings in the system.
Let's stop and focus on that one real quick. Workflow security overrides all other security settings in the system. Yeah, really. If you assign user groups to a queue and you assign document types to a queue, those users are going to be able to view those documents in that queue regardless of their other settings, regardless of their security keyword settings, regardless of their document type settings in vanilla OnBase, with a special note that you can make a queue respect security keywords.
Right.
But workflow security is set up completely differently from the rest of OnBase.
Right.
And it's not better or worse. It makes more sense for what the workflow product is. You're going to be setting up, workflow is used for setting up business processes inside OnBase. And you don't want to have to go through and build a Venn diagram to figure out if a user is going to be able to view a document in a queue and do their work. You just want to be able to add them and add the document type, and hey presto, everything works.
Right.
So it does make sense, but it is completely different from the way OnBase handles document security in the rest of the system.
Right. As we said, the biggest point of this webinar is to make sure we're bringing light to things that are overlooked, and this is one we see time and time again where someone says, well, I set up a workflow and they can't access this, so they can't see this. Well, you need to make sure you're adding them to the workflow security because it's different than the OnBase security.
Or the other way around, I've added this user to a workflow queue, now they can see a bunch of documents they're not supposed to be able to see.
Yeah. Always a scary one.
So for example, let's get the smaller bullet points up there. A big one is you can restrict the reindex action, the reindex privilege in OnBase, in vanilla OnBase, using that product rights or privileges dialog box that we saw earlier. However, even if your user group doesn't have the reindex right, if they have access to an ad hoc task that has the reindex action, they can reindex documents. This can be good and bad. Good because it means you can just add users to a workflow queue and they'll be able to do the work in the queue. Bad because, again, if you weren't expecting them to be able to reindex documents, you might be a bit taken aback when they're able to reindex things that they're not supposed to normally. Additionally, queues can optionally honor security keywords for specific document types. Again, it's optional. I think this is added in 13. You don't have to. Again, it applies in a case like HR documents are probably the biggest go-to case for this, where you've got sensitive HR documents that even workflow administrators shouldn't be able to see.
Right.
The other thing is you can grant users and user groups that are assigned to a specific workflow queue, they can be granted specific administrative accesses to those queues. So, for example, load balancing administration or assigning a user, moving a document through a queue. These things can be assigned at the queue level to users or user groups, overriding any of the workflow restricted checkbox or the product rights and privileges that we've set earlier.
Right.
So then obviously, make sure you add the appropriate user groups to all life cycles you want them to be able to access. That kind of goes without saying.
Exactly.
And that is our presentation.
Like we said before, please reach out to us if you have any questions or anything we've discussed today is something that you just doesn't feel jives well with kind of what you either think you know or what you've read or what you already believe to have set up in your system. You can always help out and lend assistance when needed. As always, you can always check out our online resources. Pixie here does our blog. It is fantastic.
It is also at blog.navient.com. We have
Correct.
a new website address that we haven't added to our slides. Sorry. And then, of course, there's the OnBase community, onbase.com/community, which is a huge resource and extremely helpful for discovering new things about OnBase.
Right, and anyone who doesn't know, obviously it is not only just the users that are in there, but Highland has a lot of customer care service representatives that go in there and answer questions, update questions, and they go through and they answer as much as they can.
There's like 2 guys in the Nebraska call center. They like never get calls, so they just live on the community site answering questions. Speaking of questions, if anyone has any questions, please type them into the chat or the questions box now. We'll give our slow typers a minute here. I'm sure you guys have questions. Come on. We didn't explain everything about rights and privileges today. All right, quiet crowd. We'll get on to our current versions. OnBase 16 is out. The current release version is 16.0014. Kofax is still at capture version 10. VRS Elite 5.1 R2. Teleform is up to version 10.8. And Brainware is at version 5.6 SP2, or should I say Perceptive Intelligent Capture. Yes.
Fancy.
I have to change the name and make it quite a bit longer.
Exactly.
More words means it's better.
I know. Once again, OnBase 16 is released. This was probably the biggest one out of all of these. Reach out to us, reach out to your account executive. They can either get you on a schedule to get upgraded with that. Some people have questions of conflicting other applications they want to make sure is compatible. We can help answer all of these questions for you. If you have any resources here are able to help out.
Yeah, I think we're going to cover it in our July webinar. The release is pretty late. We already had this webinar pretty well kicked out before 16 came out.
It just came out last week, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
So yeah, we'll cover it in our next webinar, all the new features. There are quite a few new features in 16.
Right. Head out to community as well. There's also quite a few videos out there that Highland has released that talks about kind of the benefits, features, kind of all the updates. There's quite a few enhancements, customer enhancements that have been added in there. So our next webinar is going to be July 20th. Topic to be determined, most likely OnBase 16.
OnBase 16,
exactly. Yeah. And the Navient conference. So last year we were up at Lambeau Field in Green Bay,
and we had record attendance. Thanks for everybody who came. It was great.
Everyone who did come can attest to how awesome an event that was. It was beautiful being up in the Champions Lounge and overlooking the field. The next one we're going to keep local. Obviously we are based in Verona, Wisconsin, which is just outside of Madison, but we have Monona Terrace, which overlooks Lake Monona. It is an absolutely gorgeous staple of Madison.
Gorgeous convention center, and we are going to rent out quite a large amount of it from what I've heard. So yeah. It's going to be a big convention. We're looking forward to seeing you guys there.
Tons of workshops, the ability to network with other OnBase users, and kind of get to know us a little bit better, put a face to these lovely voices, and kind of strengthen the relationships. So
with that, thank you very much for listening. This has been a presentation of your Navient Customer Care Group. Remember, you guys can give us a call, 1-800-686-8789, and our support email box is always open, support@navient.com, and of course our new website, www.navient.com. Have a great day.
Thanks for joining us, guys.